Welcome everyone to our webinar hosted by Agena Bioscience and GenXys. We are delighted to host this educational webinar. If you have any ideas for future webinars or would like to be a guest, please email the GenXys educational team at info@genexys.com. Now I would like to pass it over to our host. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Manning, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar titled Unlocking Precision Medicine, Implementing a Novel PGx Prescribing Program. My name is Glenn Sawyer. I'm the Associate Director of Clinical Genetics at Agena, and it's a privilege to be able to host this webinar with our partners, GenXys. And we have the distinct pleasure of having our guests, Dr. Otito Iwuchukwu and Heather Gerich, to join us for this panel discussion. Hello. The agenda for today's webinar, first we have the welcome, and then we will next be introducing Heather and Dr. Otito, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion, and at the end we'll open it up for questions, and you can enter your questions into the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be able to address those within the last portion of this webinar. It's my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Otito Iwuchukwu. She's the Director of Pharmacogenomics Implementation and Education at Carewell Health. She's also an Associate Professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Translational Medicine, Pharmacogenomics, and Pharmacogenetics. Educational background, Dr. Otito has experience with clinical pharmacology from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, as well as her PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from Temple University. And she also has Master of Arts in Industrial and Organizational Psychology, again from Fairleigh Dickinson University. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Otito.
Thank you, Glenn.
Next, we have Heather Gerich from Agena. Heather is currently the National Director of Sales for Agena Bioscience. She was recently promoted in this role after being very successful in the roles of most recently the Senior Manager of Clinical Implementation, Program Development, and Application Sales for all of North America. So helping labs get integrated and up and running with their pharmacogenomics and oncology programs. And prior to that, she was a Senior Territory Sales Manager with Agena. Heather's background is she has a Bachelor of Science focusing in microbiological sciences and in immunology from San Francisco State University. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open the discussion of our panel and our topics with this question. And Heather, we'll start with you for answering, but the question is, what are common or significant barriers to implementing new technologies or programs in healthcare?
Yeah, so based on feedback from laboratories and healthcare providers who are looking to implement new technologies, adding new testing to their requisition menus, education certainly prevails as a key barrier. Education of the clinical provider and prescribers, education to help them really understand when and how to order the test. And specifically for pharmacogenomics, when to order pre-therapeutic pharmacogenomic testing. As we know that this can certainly allow them to be successful in guiding their drug selection, determining the initial drug dose, and also predicting the time required to achieve a steady state of the particular drug. Pre-therapeutic pharmacogenomic testing also gives that clinician insight into the potential variations of a patient's pharmacokinetic profile, which can render guidance for optimal drug dosing for a particular patient. We noticed that oftentimes that is the barrier, is just educating and providing messaging to those prescribers so that they know exactly when and how to order this test.
Thank you, Heather. Dr. Otito, any comments on the educational portion? In your role at Carewell, are you seeing that as a barrier to implementing PGx programs?
Yeah, I saw that. And it's not just the, clinicians though. I feel like, there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be aligned when you're trying to implement pharmacogenomics. And I also see genomics as basically a change management thing, right? People are trying to get onboarded with this new system. So you really have to work from different angles, right? Think about people's habits, what they're already used to. This is a new thing that would it be a risk to, their current rules and all of that? So you have to think about that. But education is one. And I would say something else is in terms of the robustness of the clinical decision support system. Sometimes that integration, right? It's normally a key barrier to me that I've seen. And also you have, think about it from the perspective of risk, right? For the institutions trying to implement this is what's going to be our return on investment, right? Is there something that we, can use to say that if we put this new technology in, it's going to benefit us, right? Like, yes, I know the benefits of pharmacogenomics, but I'm also, basically a business. I have to find some returns on this new technology you're asking me to bring in, right? Then there's a question of reimbursement and all. So,
absolutely. And in terms, you mentioned risk, and one of the things that I often hear from customers, and I'd love both of your perspective on this, is how to actually interpret the clinical utility of the results to determine how best to treat a patient with the appropriate medicines and regimes. So any thoughts there? Because obviously those are things that people take into consideration when implementing, and some of the risks, and as you mentioned, return on investment. So what are your thoughts on the actual interpretation of clinical utility of results?
I mean, you kind of, to me, I feel like you have to start from the baseline of the most evidence, right? Because I think most of us in healthcare think evidence, evidence, evidence. And so in terms of utility, there are the drug gene implementations that have been shown to have a good return on investment. We have the data on that. So it's a question of, you can extrapolate from this if you needed to, but at least you're starting with something that kind of works, right? So in that way, you're mitigating your risk.
Thank you, Dr. Otito. And Heather, in your experience in working with laboratories from the commercial perspective and helping them get implemented, do you have any thoughts on, are you asked about the clinical evidence, as Dr. Otito mentioned, or the clinical utility about the results?
I am. In fact, I actually, I have individuals who ask me about how do they make sense of the differences and clinical consensus of what's clinically actionable.
Mm-hmm.
There's various professional societies. We're familiar with, CPIC, the FDA, PharmG, GKB. They all provide annotation and they assign levels of evidence. But these levels of evidence oftentimes are subject to change over time, and they're routinely updated electronically. So one of the concerns and questions that I get is how does a lab keep up with that? How does this diagnostic entity, how do they keep up with the new information that changes and evolves over time? That certainly is a big concern with those looking to bring on PGx testing into their laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And another, Dr. Otito, another portion you mentioned, of course, is the elephant in the room, reimbursement, right? So what are your thoughts on actually shifting the paradigm from thinking about just reimbursement solely to potentially changing the perspective to looking at the cost benefit analysis of preemptive testing in order to reduce adverse drug effects or severe toxicity? So what are your thoughts there on the potential of shifting that paradigm? Because obviously reimbursement is always a consideration, but how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, if I had my way, the paradigm would have shifted already, right? But I think that there's no one who tries to bring pharmacogenomics on, right? At least the champions who are not aware of the fact that the cost-benefit analysis really leans towards benefits, right? Yeah, it has some costs, but it leans majorly toward benefits. And so the key thing to me is to be able to ride the winds, right? Because eventually there will be a benefit, but it's just in the short term, how do you, manage the risk associated with basically not I don't want to say making money, because this is, kind of like a clinical tool, but basically not getting a return, right? The kinds of returns that you would like to make. And I think from the insurance perspective is also for us as, I guess, advocates in this field to keep pushing so that there's more, right? There's more uptake of reimbursement, because you can always balance the equation on both sides, right? If there's greater reimbursement, there'll be greater uptake. So we don't want to lose sight of that. But at the same time, we also want to be able to convince, institutions that there's benefit in this, irrespective of the fact that there might be a short-term, loss in the beginning, if anything.
That's great perspective. Thank you. And Heather, in your dealings with customers as well, obviously reimbursement comes up. So how do customers typically approach you or speak about reimbursement in your experience?
Yes, so customers are obviously, as Dr. Otito mentioned, they're concerned that it is a business for them, so they certainly they cannot sustain losses when it comes to this testing. But where the conversation starts to pivot is actually just looking at a new paradigm. When we look at pharmacogenetic testing, you're looking at moving from a reimbursement-based, establishing a reimbursement-based program within your organization to actually looking at return on investment. So moving more towards a value-based healthcare approach so that you understand what value you can actually recognize from having PGx, preemptively, so that you can save overall to the healthcare system and not just generate revenue through the reimbursement aspect. So I think it's all about kind of pivoting and looking at value-based healthcare versus just the upfront reimbursement. I think that's really critical.
Thank you. Yeah, and I agree. I'm in the camp with Dr. Otito where I wish that the paradigm had already shifted to that, and eventually we hope it'll get there. But thank you both for that input. One of the other aspects that we talk about as far as barriers is the actual infrastructure. So, what instrumentation or technology to bring in, as well as the software solutions. Heather, you mentioned previously being able to keep up with all of the changes. So, Dr. Otito, in your experience, what are some of the things that you look for as far as infrastructure when considering bringing on a program to implement a PGx in your laboratory?
Well, in my case, you kind of look at the ease of use, right? In terms of PGx already is a very complex test, right? And I think that was a key thing that I really had to basically, assuage people about, right? This is a very complex test. So now you're doing it. And then you want to you want the readouts to be accessible. You want people to be able to get that readout as quickly as possible as well. So these are all the considerations that we had when we were looking for vendors, right? And I mean, obviously, we kind of picked the ones that worked on all the parameters that we had picked, but that's what I would look at in terms of, what's the ease of use, right? How quickly can you get to your data if you needed to use your data? And I mean, we could look at integrating into what's currently on ground, but that adds costs and greater complexity to the project. So if it was a situation where you could use a third party, why not, right? So these are the kinds of considerations that we took into play when we were working.
That's great insight. Thank you. And that actually leads us really well into the next question. So what we have next is, what are some of the potential solutions or approaches that can be explored to overcome these challenges, these barriers that are associated with adopting these programs? And Dr. Otito, since you had just expanded on ease of use, accessibility, I'd love to start this question off with you and get your perspective on some of the potential approaches.
Okay, so for one thing, I think in terms of the approach is basically to have stakeholder alignment, right? So if everybody's on board, you can, I think that makes it easier to transition to whatever new system you want to be using. And the key thing that I know with many of the cloud-based, reporting software is they basically update it as the evidence is being updated. So you don't have that question of old evidence, right? Which I really, really appreciate, because if you had it if you were to do almost like a static knowledge base, right, you have to go through the question of updating, periodic updates. But if you're using a third-party tool in that sense, you know that they have to keep their products current, right? So to me, I think that's one way you could, mitigate that. Obviously, you have to think about security concerns, right? And in terms of access, in terms of the data storage, and who gets access to the reporting. But that's something that the system and the third-party vendor, if there is a third-party vendor, could come together to build a policy around that, right? So to me, it's a question of, you have to have a champion, you have to have somebody who is going to be overseeing that, and there should be crosstalk among all the stakeholders involved.
Thank you, and that leads well to Heather. Dr. Otito just mentioned, stakeholders and vendors. So, in your experience, can you speak on potentially, utilization of vendors as resources, or also consultants to help tailor solutions?
Yes, certainly. So, as it relates to some of these hurdles, Dr. Otito mentioned that choosing a analytical strategy that's has ease of use and that is easy to implement and to utilize and to get everyone on board and everyone aligned so that they're utilizing it consistently. There's a lot involved, particularly on the technical aspect of that. So the analytical validation piece, being able to validate the assay so that you know that it works properly, accurately, and that it's going to yield the results that your providers and prescribers need so that you can improve patient outcomes. Many times you can approach and gain assistance for these types of processes from vendors such as Agena offer clinical implementation support for analytical validation, and they provide guidance in terms of how to appropriately build out sound and solid SOPs for lab developed tests, for protocols for your validation study. They also will help with guidance in terms of where to source specimens that are used during the analytical validation. So there are a lot of resources out there for a healthcare facility that wants to bring on pharmacogenetic testing, and oftentimes this can come from the vendor who can assist with this and make sure that the process is streamlined and easy and can make it actually can lower the threshold of change, right? So that you can make it smooth and validate in a timely manner. And as well as vendors, there's also a host of consultants who can assist with this process. They can work with the laboratory and medical directors and all those key stakeholders to ensure that everyone is aligned and that the process is very smooth for the clinical implementation.
Thank you, Heather. And that's right. I mean, we're talking about vendors and consultants can help with education, and we talked about that previously. Education being a hurdle and an obstacle. And I'd love to pose the question to you, Dr. Otito, where a lot of institutions, they have a ready resource that may be underutilized, and that's the pharmacy or the pharmacist in helping with decisions when it comes to PGx testing and interpreting results. So would you be able to expand on that a little bit to give your perspective on potentially utilizing a pharmacist when it comes to understanding and helping guide treatments?
Yeah, so as a pharmacist myself, right, I guess I could be a little biased here and say that I think pharmacists, right, the field of pharmacogenomics, right, it's kind of squarely in what we do, because you cannot talk about genomics without talking about drug metabolism, without talking about, the enzymes involved, which basically to me is the key of what we do in pharmacokinetics. And so from that perspective, I really feel like pharmacists become your best resources, as you said, for drug information. But in this case, the drug information is tailored where you're having drug gene information. And so the pharmacist becomes your, your point guard, as it were, right, for interpretation, for education, if need be. However, you know, again, back to the concept of genomics being a complex test, if you were looking at end-to-end, obviously pharmacists are not going to be the only personnel involved here. So to me, I look at it as a combination of resources, right? You go end-to-end, you have your team of people that if you were in an institution, you have a team that you could refer to, where the pharmacist then becomes, you know, the person who gets to explain the complexity of the testing and how you can use it, if anything. But in terms of education, right, I think there's no better resource that you can use than a pharmacist who is trained, right, in this field.
And I don't believe you're biased. I hear this continually, that the pharmacists, you know, need to play, you know, they're a ready resource. And as you mentioned, they're always going to be educated on the most up-to-date guidelines and be well-versed in pharmacogenomics. So they're a great resource to have. Heather, one thing I'd like to pose to you, Dr. Otito had mentioned, you know, always, of course, needing to be having with evolving evidence, having everything be updated, be in the most relevant and up-to-date guidelines. One of the solutions I'd like you to expand on a little bit is the potential of having automated clinical decision support software and how this can be helpful to laboratories.
Yes, absolutely. So having an automated clinical decision support software really distills the information down for those who are the consumers, those who are actually treating the patients. So it's quite valuable. Having an automated decision support software, it actually allows things to be done very quickly, and the results can be routed through the EHR or EMR. So that the results are delivered to the end users quite quickly. Also, the systems also help to establish for a healthcare organization how to establish clear guidelines around patient stratification. So that always seems to be an issue where there needs to be a consensus from the organization of who needs to be tested, who are those that are most likely to benefit from PGx testing. And so having this automated, you know, a program, a third-party program which can assemble all of this data and that can actually produce results where you input all of the patient demographics, all of the information regarding that specific patient, as well as the likelihood of that patient benefiting from the pharmacogenomic testing based on what drug or therapy is looking to be prescribed, really makes a lot of sense and helps organizations to meet their goals to improve patient care.
Thank you. And Dr. Otito, from your experience, you know, being, you know, leading in a laboratory and within a company, how have you seen or how have you utilized the clinical decision support software?
Yeah, so again, as Heather said, we are using an automated third-party system, and that was, you know, a deliberate choice from the perspective of the institution, because the, you know, the resources and all that will be required to have integrated into our current electronic health system would have been enormous. So basically, this was a quick, right, approach to us getting to the end, which is to be able to offer this test to our providers and, you know, potentially our patients if they choose to go that route. And so this, to me, this kind of became, you know, a way that we could get the data that we wanted. Right. Obviously, that comes with its own challenges, which I reckon we'll be discussing in a few minutes. But if it was in terms of the ease of use and the, you know, turnaround time, right, all of that becomes something where you think to say, I need the data to be able to help my patients. So, and if this is a project I'm trying to get done in X number of weeks, X number of months, I don't want to keep adding time to it, because that's then becomes a risk, right, to the project's completion. So.
Thank you. That's, again, great perspective. Appreciate that. That leads us actually into the next question that we have, which is, you know, when we're speaking about incorporating solutions, you know, how can these alternative models be implemented to shift from more of the alert-based prescribing and more towards the incorporation of pharmacogenomics results? And Dr. Otito, I'd love to get your perspective first on this.
So the thing is, with pharmacogenomic alerts, I think maybe the question of alerts becomes a red herring here, because what you need is just-in-time information, right? And so the information, how do you get it in a way that people can use it, right? So we may want to call that alerts or something else, but I think that you want information that is portable across different electronic health records, portable in different formats, as it were, right? Now, again, I think we have to think about, data security, right? HIPAA and all of that. But at the same time, right, I think that the ability to be able to get the data you need in different formats, translatable, right, across different systems becomes a key thing that we want to think about. Right? Because sometimes if you're using an external provider and they are working from, someplace else, right? Now, if they're not able to maybe get into the health system for something quick, they can still access the data, right? So the key thing is for the data that you need to make the health decisions to be available to you as at when you need it. And so to me, that portability becomes a key differentiator, right? When you're thinking about the different types of alerts and systems and, the kinds of information that providers need to access.
Thank you. And Heather, any additional thoughts there? Anything to expand?
I think just having the decision support software, it allows for the reports to be customized for each individual patient, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. It also provides background knowledge for the provider so that they understand, why am I seeing this alert? Why is this recommendation regarding a treatment dosage, or this patient should not be prescribed this particular drug? It actually provides a background for them so they can understand the full picture and understand why those specific recommendations are being made. And I think that really helps them to treat their patients much more holistically in terms of just knowing why they should steer away from one particular drug, or they should dose at a certain level.
Thank you. And one thing that, a buzzword that I've been hearing more and more often is alert fatigue, and just alerts constantly popping up, because what I've heard is that many times they don't feel there's sufficient information to easily understand the results based on evidence and guidelines. So Dr. Otito, any thoughts on the notion of alert fatigue and how we could potentially address that?
Yeah, so alert fatigue is real. I can tell you, so it's not a buzzword. So it's kind of like, you're trying to work, right, in your workflow, and you see this alerts keep popping up, and at some point you may just click away. And so the question we've always had in the field is, how do you make it in terms of actionability, right? Is it something that is a soft or a hard stop? And so the question becomes, for those that, for drugs that have to do with narrow therapeutic indices, then you may want to think about a hard stop where the physician or the provider has to take, a step before they move on. But the thing too is it all medications that need this? Probably not, but you just want them to be able to access that information when they need it. And so that's the question to me of having, and that's that portability. You want just enough information, right, for you to be able to decide whether you want to proceed, in X or Y direction, depending on the medication. Now, this is a very complex thing, because at some point, right, you then have to decide, is this critical or not? And so from an IT perspective, that then becomes the fine-tuning you have to do to make sure that not all alerts need to pop up. Some of them become silent, right, if they're not needed. And then the key ones are the ones that then need to be acted upon. So there's always that, fine-tuning that has to be done at the point of decision. However, if you had, where a portal where you could go and check the information later, that's okay. But then most people may not have that time. And so the question becomes, how much information can I fit into that square box that comes on for me to be able to do my work, whether as a pharmacist or as a physician, right? The key thing is, what is the relevance of this information coming up? And I think in pharmacogenomics, we do have, the potential to really utilize that box to be able to give providers the information they need and the kinds of, would I say, rules access, right? So if I don't need to see something, then why am I seeing that? So those are all the things that need to be done if you were doing an in-house clinical decision support system.
Thank you. And Heather, Dr. Otito just mentioned, she's talking about obviously the IT portion and being able to fine tune it. So in your experience as a vendor and dealing with customers, can you talk about how the clinical decision support software, you had mentioned customization, but how the customization of the reports for the individual patients, helps to provide that knowledge and those recommendations, like Dr. Otito was just mentioning, like the information to put in the box. Can you speak more, expand on the actual software and how that can be tailored and customized?
Yes, so the software itself, it actually it can be customized for each patient depending on what the physician or the prescriber is wanting to prescribe for that particular patient. The software offers a scalable solution for storing and organizing all patient data, and it also allows it constantly updates. So you have algorithms that are constantly running, and I know Dr. Otito mentioned this early on, but there's evolving evidence that we encounter. And so all the most recent guidelines, recommendations, and levels of evidence are all supported and updated on a regular basis. So not only is it unique to each patient, but it's also, they are having the latest up-to-date information that guides that prescriber to make the most useful choice and treat that patient most appropriately in real time, because everything's being updated. In subscribing to a clinical support decision platform, it basically simplifies the complex genetic data. It makes it actionable, and it then integrates it into that patient's record, and is very unique for each and every patient. So it's not just one alert that it shows up because you see this patient is being prescribed this particular drug and has this one specific allele. No, it is actually very unique, and it takes into many different aspects of that patient's, their background, other drugs that they may be utilizing, family history. It takes into many factors and then creates something very unique for the physician.
Thank you again for that perspective. And that leads into, directly leads into the last question that we have. And Heather, I'd like to start with you on this, because you're just talking about customizing and reporting, but how do we actually make PGx data more usable by pharmacists and prescribers? Can you expand on some of your thoughts and your experience as you're working with laboratories?
Yes. So, having a solution, like I said, that's continuously updated, also standardization. So standardization in that all the clinically relevant variants are standardized and that are represented for pan-ethnic populations. So, addressing the population of everyone who is being supported by that medical entity, that healthcare facility. And having a standardized format that translates over from the laboratory through the LIS to the electronic healthcare record or the EMR, making it accessible and linked directly to the patient record, all within the same clinical workflow.
Thank you. And Dr. Otito, being a pharmacist and having led some of these implementations, I'm sure you have some thoughts here as well. So I'll pose the same question to you to expand on what Heather has stated about how we make the actual data more usable.
Mm-hmm. I do. And I was going to ask Heather. Heather, did you take a peek at my notes? Is what I have, right? The standardization. I think we underestimate that, right? Like that standardization of the data for everyone, right? And to me, the key thing is to simplify. and basically take your users into consideration. So some time ago, what I had done from a pharmacy education point of view was I took, samples of about 5 different PGx testing provider companies, and we did a usability thing, right? So from my students' perspective, they kind of rated the reports in terms of how much, if they were a patient or as a pharmacist, right? I split them into 2 units of look at it from the perspective of a patient, look at it from the perspective of a pharmacist. And we got so much rich data in terms of the kinds of things they were saying. If this was them, this is what they'll be looking for in terms of the color coding, in terms of, all of that. And so I think sometimes that is not maybe taken into consideration enough, right? In terms of the patients who are going to be looking at this reports, right? The pharmacists, the physicians, because everybody comes with their own perspective, as it were, right? And so taking all of that into consideration, trying to simplify the data, because we're all busy and we need to be able to, like I said about just in time, I need data that can allow me to make a decision, not just for the knowledge of it, but how do I take this data? How do I translate it into everyday practice? And I know from, health system perspectives, some of the drug information databases already do this, but it's as is, right? If I'm interested in pharmacogenomics, so I'll click on it and learn more, but that may not be everyone. So how do you make it so that everyone has at least some level of access to this information that, it's presented in easy to read, easy to understand language, right? Because we're professionals doesn't mean that I would not appreciate something like what I'll call a drug gene card, right? Pharmacists are very used to this flashcards that we use for our top 300 medications. And so the same ideology goes in terms of how can I just get what I need on, a mobile flashcard format so that I can incorporate the information as I'm doing my work, right? So those are the kinds of things, I think about just when I'm working, when I'm talking with my students and all of that, like how can we make this more simplified, right? In terms of, and the simplification is not, you're not necessarily, dumbing down the data or anything, but you're making it so that it's usable to me as I'm going along, right? The other thing to do is, ways in which other pharmacists in other ancillary fields can have access to this information, because, what I hear all the time is, oh, pharmacogenomics is like a niche space. And I said, I wish it weren't. I wish people didn't have that perspective, because all of us as pharmacists, whether you're in the community, whether you're in the healthcare system, even in industry, we can incorporate this information into the kinds of things that we do, or even alert people to the possibilities of this field. But we can't do that if it's basically, I have to go somewhere to get a master's, or I have to do a certification. So it's a question of how do we get that data accessible to everyone?
Thank you. And obviously you're speaking from experience, and I hear simplify, 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 and obviously, challenges with color coding and interpretation. So can you speak to an example of some of the challenges that you may have faced previously and how the solution that you've currently incorporated has helped resolve that or help to simplify some of those challenges?
So in terms of, again, we are using the automated third-party system. So I know we gave some of this feedback, and I know the reporting companies too are not sitting on their oars, right? I know they're doing this from a psychological testing perspective and all that in terms of, how the eye tracks, the kinds of colors that are useful to us. And I know from a regulatory perspective, right, the use of the red, green, yellow is no longer basically, best practice, right? And so the key thing becomes, how do you make it so that people don't get nervous if they're looking at this data, because it's just data, right? The fact that you're a poor metabolizer doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. You're just a poor metabolizer for X gene. So how do you present it in the most neutral way that can then allow people to use the data for other things and not like, scare people, right? From that perspective of, oh, there's something wrong in this test. And so, I feel like what we use right now, I like it, right? It was one of the ones I had presented presented to the students, and they ranked it highly just because of that. Like it puts you at ease in that sense. I think for many of them, the use of red and all of that was kind of, maybe there's something wrong. So all of those little considerations, right? I gave feedback to the vendor at the time, but I think that's it, right? I will not also go with, the traffic light approach, even though it looks nice, right? It looks nice to be able to look and say, red is for danger. But I think about it from, my perspective personally of how we had gotten, a report for newborn screening, and I know how nervous we were. So I always think about that from that perspective of, you have to think about the user, right? It's okay to do anything you're doing from, the perspective of the provider and the person doing the test, but what about the person receiving that report, right? Whether you're receiving it as a physician or as a patient, how do you, customize it, right? So that if the physician needs to get something that will say, hey, treat this patient differently. But then if that report is going to the patient needs to get it in the most, neutral way possible. Because to me, there's nothing about pharmacogenomics that is, something to say, oh, run to the theater right now, right? It's something you can modulate with the drugs as the person goes on. And so all of those have to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. And I really like that personal perspective, right? The human perspective of, when you receive these results, how are you going to interpret it? And Heather, I'd like to just ask you if you have any thoughts on that, expand on that in your dealings with various laboratories, various institutions, if you're hearing similar feedback from the people that you interact with.
Yes, and I can tell you, Dr. Otito's feedback is very similar, but no two healthcare organizations will have the exact same feedback. So when you talked about customization, having a solution that allows you to customize your test reports in the way that you feel are most appropriate for those consumers, whether it's the clinician or it's the report that actually goes to the patient, having the ability to customize and work with a test report provider who can customize based on what you feel is appropriate for your organization, I think that's key. And so I mentioned earlier, there's not one size fits all. So it's highly advantageous to work with a provider who can build a solution for you that can incorporate those customized features and preferences that you have. Exactly like what Dr. Otito was mentioning in terms of how she sees the data best consumed by all stakeholders and end users.
Thank you. That's a great perspective as well. And I want to thank you both for the engagement as we go through these questions. And in the interest of getting to some of the questions that we've heard from the audience, I would love to open it up for Q&A. And if you do have questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box, and we'll answer these as we're able. And if we don't have the opportunity to address your question, we can look for direct follow-up as well. But the first one that I'll pose to Dr. Otito and Heather, I have a question here. It relates earlier to what we've talked about as the elephant in the room with reimbursement, but it's saying that with the huge range of insurance carriers and different plans, plus of course non-coverage in some instances, do you have any thoughts on cash pay for PGx? Dr. Otito, I'll start with you.
So I'll answer that question from the perspective of autonomy, right? In terms of if the patient wants to pay, then why not? But if you're thinking about equity, right, then it's the question of, can the patient afford to pay? Those are two different things. But I don't see, any reason why if the patient wants to pay for it, then you say no, right? I feel like everyone should be given autonomy in terms of the kinds of things that they want to do. The other part of that question that I think is implicit is if the patient does it outside and then they bring it in, would you be able to use it, right? So that becomes almost like a different part of that question, because you also don't want a patient having to do multiple pharmacogenomic tests if you can avoid it, right? And so the question becomes, how do we bridge any of that? But I don't see why, if the patient wants to pay cash, they wouldn't be allowed to. But if they're not able to afford it, then that becomes a different question.
Very true. And Heather, I know obviously as vendors, we see a range of this. We see, obviously both cash pay as well as reimbursement through healthcare. So any thoughts there as well to expand on what Dr. Otito said?
Sure. And I think, I think it's great to offer it as an option for a patient who's their own healthcare advocate. They advocate for themselves. And if they want to equip themselves with this critical information, I think it's wonderful. I think that the healthcare or the diagnostic entity who's running it, though, has to be cautious about what technology they select, because they need to take on a technology that is cost effective and where they can make it financially feasible for a patient to actually purchase their own. If the payers are not going to pay for it, then it needs to be palatable in terms of financial. So, I would encourage, if you are thinking about going a direct to consumer model, certainly work with a vendor who can provide a very cost effective test for you so that it's just not so outrageously overpriced that the patient cannot sustain the cost.
And one of the next questions, we'll stay on this topic because we have another question. Heather, I'll start with you because you had mentioned consultants earlier, but the question is that, obviously anyone who's been around PGx over the years, we've seen it be in fashion, then go out of fashion, and then looks like it's starting to come back in fashion. And a lot of that has to do with, obviously around 10 years ago, there may have been some overbilling or denial of payment. So the thought is, some of the early adopters, people that may have been affected by this, may be a little gun shy. So what are your thoughts on advancing, moving forward and figuring out how institutions may be able to implement PGx, and as we've talked about, make sure that there's that ROI or that benefit?
Yes, absolutely. So, so you mentioned, consultants. There are several reimbursement and or paying consultants out there who can help. They can help you if you want to bring on PGx testing. They can help you discern what groups of genes and or what disease specific groups of genes and panels that are more consistently reimbursed by different payers, whether it's a private payer or CMS. And I would definitely highly encourage you to work with someone who has expertise in this area to ensure that what you bring on board and what you're providing for your clinicians and or direct to consumer patients, that it is something that is reliably paid, and that there has been history of those particular genes being identified as the most clinically actionable. So they're the tier 1 genes, the CPIC recommendations that are more readily paid for than others.
And Dr. Otito, any thoughts there as well on, obviously you mentioned, sometimes pharmacogenomics thought of as niche and then people may be gun shy. So anything to expand on there?
No, I'm not. There's nothing to add.
Yeah.
Heather said it all in that sense, right? Bring in consultants or people who are, I guess that's where the nicheness comes in, right? People who know what genes are able to, get you reimbursement, right? And I think those are all the conversations that I had before you even start the implementation, so that you don't, at the point of implementation realize, oh, we have a population for the genes for which we don't get coverage. But the good thing about, pharmacogenomics, I think, is there are certain key genes that really would apply to many therapeutic areas, right? So there's no way, if you planned out your implementation properly, that you will not be able to get some form of reimbursement per gene, right? Based on the gene.
Yeah. And Dr. Otito, the last question that we have time for to address, I'd like to start with you because this is relevant in the field of pharmacogenomics, is that what are your thoughts on how we address the barrier of having a genetically diverse population, perhaps mixed ancestry, or populations that are poorly represented?
So in terms of that, right, I think, again, we come back to this panel-based testing, right? I think that if you think about it, even if we talk about mixed ancestry, there's still going to be the prevalence of, certain genetic variants that you could then implement, right? And if you are having a population that is poorly represented, then it's as part of your implementation, it will be good practice or best practice to try to customize those variants. The issue there, to customize variants that may be represented in that population. But the question there becomes that of actionability, right? And it's like a catch-22, right? The rare variants, there's not enough information for us to build up the evidence base. And we need the evidence base in order, to do the actionability for prescribing. And so I feel like the more we continue to gather the data, right, on the presence of the variants in those populations, the more we can build up the evidence base that allows us to come back and use it in those populations. But, there are genes, there are variants that have widespread utility. And I'll start from there if you want people of, mixed ancestry and poorly represented populations to get some of the benefits of pharmacogenomics, because I feel like we cannot afford to wait, right, when there's already information that we can use in the meantime, right?
Thank you. And Heather, are you hearing anything additional from people that you interact with on challenges with diversity in the data?
No, I think Dr. Otito summed it up. I do know that whenever you have a laboratory and they're validating some of these more rare variants, it can become a challenge. And that's where, like Dr. Otito said, collecting more data and preserving those samples. And once you find some of those rare variants that may be specific to certain populations, utilize that, keep those samples and make sure that you're able to analytically validate and clinically validate those results so that you can incorporate that into your routine screen with the panel that you're running.
And with that, this is a good segue to within the pharmacogenomics community. I know there's an initiative ongoing with the All of Us initiative looking to get diversity within the genomic databases. So there's a plug for, if you haven't heard of or would like to get more information on All of Us, there's that opportunity as well, as we're looking to diversify the genetic databases so that we're serving all diverse populations. With that, on behalf of Agena Biosciences and GenXys, I want to thank you all for participating, and a special thank you to Dr. Otito Iwuchukwu and Heather Gerich for joining us on our panel. We will be able to have this recording, and we will send out follow-up emails, and we'll also look to answer any of those questions that we didn't have a chance to address live. Again, thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.